Jonah chapter 2. What kind of literary work is this? Who is the protagonist, and what gems lie in this chapter about life, faith, and community? Stick around to find out. Welcome to Past the Pulpit, where we dive in beyond the sermon to look at life, love, faith, and community. Each week we ask of the preaching text what hopes, challenges, and passions lie at the heart of the sermon. Welcome to episode 13, Jonah's Song. So good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, Pastor Raewyn, how are you?
Good. We're here.
Yes.
Today we're going to be looking at Jonah chapter 2. So let's start by reading the chapter. Pastor Icky, would you read it for us?
Absolutely. Let's read it together. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. You cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. How shall I look again upon your holy temple? The waters closed in over me. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. At the roots of the mountains, I went down to the land, whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. As my life was ebbing away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Deliverance belongs to the Lord. Then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it spewed Jonah out upon the dry land.
So, Pastor Icky, in your sermon, you talked about this being satire. I never thought about the book of Jonah before being satire. So, as we're talking about satire, do either of you have a favorite satire or a satirist?
Yeah, I think there's a few good ones out there. One of my favorite is probably Saturday Night Live. Especially the Weekend Update, where they do the news, and then they do it in a funny way that kind of critiques our world, but also kind of like puts in front of us, hey, we probably need to fix a few things.
Yeah.
That's a good one. When I think of satire, as Pastor Icky and we were all talking, is The Office. I started that a few years ago, actually. I'm fairly new to the Office team, and I love it. I think it's so funny. At first, I started watching it, and I was like, I don't get it. And then I was like, I need to not take it so seriously.
Yeah.
And I went back and I watched it, and I love it. I think it's so funny, and just like the camaraderie that they have in the office, as you were saying, it's so good.
And I think that can only happen in satire, but that's what makes it so good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, my favorite satirist, as it were, is Trevor Noah. And
yeah.
I have a personal connection to him because he's from South Africa. And I love his book, Born a Crime. If you haven't read it yet, it is really good. And the title itself is satire. How can you be born a crime?
Right.
And yet at that time,
that's so good.
it was during apartheid, and his parents were interracial. And so his very birth was illegal, as it were.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh.
So powerful stuff.
Melanie, you and my wife are in the same boat. She absolutely loves Trevor Noah.
I love Trevor Noah too.
Oh, yeah?
I
Really?
am a big Trevor Noah fan.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's really good.
It's interesting because I think sometimes the issue that people might have with Jonah is it fiction or is it nonfiction?
Mm-hmm.
Is this a real story that happened historically in the world, or is this a made-up story to make a point? And I think if we spend a lot of time arguing over that, we lose like the beauty of the actual story, which is satire. I mean, could be fictional, could not be. This is a non-fictional character used in a story. I think if we wasted time on fictional, non-fictional, we'd lose the point, the beauty of this particular satire.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so in your message, you mentioned that this particular chapter that we're talking about, chapter 2, is poetry within the satire. And I love that. You quoted Rosemary Nixon, author, from the Message of Jonah. And she talks about poetry like a key change. And it tells the story of what just happened, but in a different way.
Right, right. We see that often in musicals or, where they shift from like the scenario they're in to sing a song about the scenario they're in.
Yeah.
And
Love that. That's the best part.
Is it? Dude, you get the chills. You're
Yes.
you're moved emotionally because you understand the scenario you're in, but now like they've found like some beautiful poetic way to express. One of my favorite scenes is from the Frozen series, Frozen 2, where I think it's Anna, the one doesn't have the powers.
The younger sister.
She's stuck in that dark cave.
Yeah.
And she's ready to give up, and then she sings that song.
The next best thing.
Oh,
yeah.
The next best thing.
It's so good. And right now I'm actually listening to the book, The Next Best Thing, which is amazing.
Is that right?
We're talking about the next best thing. Yeah. Side note.
I love that.
But really great. Yeah. So in that moment, we see it in a different way. So we're going to dive deeper into the poetry. And I also did not realize, I wouldn't have noticed just reading it in English, that this is a chiasm.
Yes. Yeah. The chiastic structure is, that's a very common thing for the Hebrew writers, but we don't catch it as often unless we're in it, in the text, because we have to preach it or something,
Yeah, it's not our normal way of writing, and so
Yeah.
we don't automatically look for it. But that
No,
is amazing.
I think in our world we are linear, and so we expect the climax to be at the end.
Yeah.
Right? That's where we're shooting that way. And in this particular structure, it's centered in the middle so that you can move from both ends towards it, and then from it back out.
So let's back up for a minute and look at the poem as a whole. And how does this poem as a whole reflect our world today?
If we're looking at it in that pyramid type structure, we see the beginning and the end kind of match, and then they'll match as they head towards the central point in the poem. So Jonah says, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me, which will have its partner down at the bottom. Salvation belongs to the Lord. So we already see the rhythm here. B would be, out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you hear my voice. And B at the bottom would be, but I with the voice of thanksgiving will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will pay. So we see it, right? The top here, he's making cry out. The bottom is a response. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. Your waves and your billows passed me over. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope and steadfast love. Now, I think what's interesting about C here, if we just pause for a quick second, is that if we remember in chapter 1, God didn't cast Jonah out.
Yeah.
It was Jonah who ran away. And then it was also Jonah who chose to jump out of the boat, right? That was not God. But the scenario that he's in, and as he's like looking back at how his decisions have led him to this place, he kind of says, man, God, you really have forsaken me. I wonder if we could spend some time there this morning talking about how maybe we do that. Sometimes we sabotage our own spiritual formation and then kind of get angry at others, maybe even God.
Blame God.
Yeah.
No, that part really stood out to me too, because when I was reading it, for you cast me into the deep, I was like, wait a second, like that doesn't sound right. Like that, Jonah, you did this to yourself. Like you chose all of these paths. This part really stood out to me, and just interesting how he like puts himself and says these words.
Jonah's an interesting character. I think he's kind of the model for the person who has yet to find real transformation in his heart.
That's really powerful. And it's so sad because God is not losing out in this story. The people are being rescued, right? But Jonah's missing out. He's not experiencing any of the joy of that. He's angry and bitter, and he's like in dark places, right? And even in this redemption moment, so his life is brought back from the pit, but he's still concerned about paying back God, like a vow and a payment. And
Yeah, very contractual.
yeah, and then so the part that stood out to me the most is C, that same. So the C on the top of the poem is "For you cast me into the deep," but the C at the bottom is "Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love." And I feel like that is the heart of Jonah's problem. He's following God, but he's following an idol, not God. So
Yeah.
he thinks he's serving God and he's
Yeah.
following God, but his real commitment is to his perception of what justice ought to look like.
Wow.
And that's his idol. And maybe his own self-righteousness is an idol. And the thing that he's missing is hope of steadfast love. So he's not understanding God's love for the Ninevites, but that also means he doesn't get God's love for him.
Indeed. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. And on the bottom, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. And then E, we begin to see how the scenario tightens up in his actual current situation. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. And then we see the central point here. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. So this is where he finds himself. Like we've gotten to this place. And it's actually at this place, if we're reading back out, where things begin to change for him. I don't know that we all need to have like a bottom out situation in our life before we make a change, but obviously Jonah had to get there before he could make some real transformation happen. When we see it moving out, the chiasmus drives towards Jonah's situation, and then Jonah reflecting on that and saying, I know where my salvation comes from. Salvation belongs to the Lord, which is back at A.
Yeah.
Right. That's like now he's driving back out in that direction.
It definitely is a very clear hitting rock bottom description, right?
Yeah. Especially when you get to the lines of like E and F, like you just like almost the emotion shifts, as we were saying earlier, and you just really start to get very you see the emotion in scripture.
But what's most interesting about it is that we don't see a real clear repenting.
No.
Like Jonah doesn't have a moment like that.
No.
It's more of a contractual, like covenantal type. Hey, have you ever woken up and you're like, oh man, I forgot I got a test today. Lord, if you get me through this one test, I promise I'll ...
Yeah.
It's kind of that kind of scenario.
Yeah, making a vow. So you shared before in the message too, like that this is not a healthy approach to God. And why is that? Why is it not a healthy approach?
I think you hit it on the dot earlier, because it misses the true character of God. So like I love the power of God, but I don't want to live by God's prerogative of love, because I want justice to look the way that it feels to me. Right. And Jonah's kind of in this place, which we understand. You could imagine all of the atrocities and the horrific scenes that happened under the regime of this particular nation. I mean, it's hard to be like, all right, let's forgive and forget and love each other.
It's human nature to only think of people based on their worst, right? And forget that they're human. They are people that God loves, and that there is good in them, that God appeals to, right? But when someone's hurt us or a group of people have hurt us, it's easy for us to paint all of them that way. And not see the both and in them and both and in ourselves.
A few months ago, Dr. John Webster was on here when he had preached in the series A House on Fire. And he was sharing how there was a young lady who was working in a particular area, and her daughter was killed by one of the captains, I think. And her decisive action after that was to reconcile with this person, because if we continue to hate on the hate and hurt for hurt, where would we end up?
Yeah.
Right. And so her story is powerful because she does something that's almost unhuman, like
Mhm.
the power to forgive and reconcile after having a loved one taken away. It's
Mhm.
major.
Yeah, that's divine love right there, right?
Divine.
That's the essence of the cross, that
Right,
God loves
right.
us so much that God gave God's only son, right?
Yeah.
In order to win us back. Yeah.
And that's what Jonah's being called to do here. I don't think Jonah wants to do that.
No.
He misses the mark a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So, shall we go back to the narrative and look at the end of the story? I never paid attention to the fish before. He was really a side character.
Which in the kids division, the fish is the main character.
Oh, yeah?
actually.
Is that right? Is that right?
It's all about the fish, actually.
Well, apparently in the narrative, it is all about the fish. The fish is the only one God is speaking to in this story here.
And it's such a small piece of the chapter. It's literally one verse, right?
Yeah.
It's not even a long verse. It doesn't give you a lot of filler. It just says, then the Lord spoke to the fish, and it spewed Jonah out upon the dry land. And that's it. And we tend to look past it. We don't think about it
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah.
We think about the fish.
Yeah, that is beautiful that the fish could hear God's voice and Jonah
Yes.
couldn't.
Right. Hey.
I think that's so beautiful.
Oh, my goodness.
That we serve a God who is so in tune with not only his creation, all of his creations, his people, and animals.
Yeah. So I never thought about this fish very much. And I love in the sermon you mentioned that this is a safe place for Jonah. And it's dark. It's like death. I mean, in the middle of the poem, he says that he goes down to the land where you'd stay forever, right? So there's a clear parallel with the fish, the inside of the fish, and death. And there's this darkness. And yet, death isn't the end of the story.
Right.
And so what is the difference between a safe place that feels like death and actual death?
I think when you are in a particular place in your life, it's hard to tell the difference. When you are going through things. And I think that's what the beauty of the church. We get to be the place that is safe for people who are going through Sheol-like experiences. But they find safety here, and they may not recognize it as safety, so they may be upset. They may come to this place frustrated and angry. They may spew out some of their pain, because they don't recognize the healing that's already begun, the safety that's
I love
here.
that.
But I think much like the fish, as a community, our calling is to listen for the voice of God and not act out before God speaks.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Wow.
what could we do together if we're patiently loving and caring and creating safety for people all the way through the process until God says, now,
Send them out.
yeah, send them
Spew them out for a
now.
mission.
Yeah, put them out there. They're ready to go.
That's great. Yeah. I love that challenge of the community.
Yeah, I think we all have a great task to do. The truth is, it's not easy.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes as Christians, like, we have this very pretty view or idea of like, man, we're going to save the lost and we're going to give them the word of God, and they're going to come in and they're going to just be like, change their life. Because I think people, for some reason, think transformation happens instantly. But I don't know. For me, in my experience and what I've seen, it feels as if transformation is a lifetime journey.
It is.
And we have to be committed to that and to each other.
I love that. I think of the fish, and I wonder how painful a process it was for the fish, like indigestion. This person moving around in your belly, complaining or whatever, and
Yeah, Jonah has the nerve to complain.
yeah. But that discomfort that leads to a new mission for Jonah. Even though he doesn't really have his heart in it. But that is a crucial part of the story, and that we can be a crucial part of what God's doing in the world. And that it might be uncomfortable, and we might wonder, why are we holding on to this annoying prophet here? But here we are.
What are some practical things that the listeners can take away from our time today?
The thing that strikes me the most in this moment is that if you're going through the dark, that it is difficult, but it could be that even though you can't feel it or see God in that moment, that God is doing an important work in you for the sake of God's kingdom. And so be gracious to yourself.
Ooh,
don't feel like you're supposed to be accomplishing a lot during this time. Cry out to God. Your voice goes to God. Jonah says, I don't know if I'm ever going to see the Holy Temple again. But then in the shift, he says, but my voice has reached your holy temple. And so when you're in the darkness, you can't see God, you can't see the temple, yet be gracious to yourself. Allow yourself to go through that dark space, because God is doing something in the midst of there.
Oh, that's so good, Raewyn. That is so good. I mean, Jonah was in there for about 3 days.
Yeah.
That's resurrection.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
That's resurrection.
And Jesus mentions like Jonah in the belly of the whale when he talks about his own resurrection.
Yeah.
I really reflected on the first verse that we read through, or I should say the second one that says, I called to the Lord out of my distress and he answered me. And I really love that, because I think so often when we are going through a dark journey, like it's so easy to stay silent. And we stay silent mainly because sometimes we just don't even know what we need. And so we don't know how to necessarily put the words together to understand and express our desires. And I love this verse because Jonah is calling out to the Lord, and then there's an immediate response of saying the Lord answered. And so I think that just a reminder, even if you don't know you're in the darkness quite yet, as Pastor Icky was talking about, sometimes we just don't realize it until we're out of it. But know that like as you call out, even in your silence, that God is answering you and that the Lord is with you.
Wow, that's good. For me, it was reflecting on what Raewyn said just a few minutes ago when she said, the fish heard God, even though Jonah didn't hear God. And I'm reminded that God is speaking, and it may be that there are all kinds of people that will be leading that we don't expect.
Yeah.
So to keep our eyes open to where God is speaking and who God is speaking and who God wants to use, and then empower that and say, this is true, this is right, and this is from God. That was a great time in chapter 2.
Enjoyed it.
Who's with us next? What are we talking about next week?
We'll find out. Jonah chapter 3.
Jonah chapter 3. Jonah's struggle, our problem. That's it. All right, friends. We'll see you then. Be well.
All right. Be well.